Somewhere in the world, a king is at war with his own mother. In a land where political loyalties shift like the sands of the desert, where the future of nations hang in the balance, this is no simple family quarrel. This is a battle for the very soul of a kingdom, the beginning of an empire, and a moment that would alter the course of history forever. The year is 1128, and the air is thick with tension. The once peaceful hills of northern Portugal are now the setting for a conflict of epic proportions. On one side stands Afonso Henriquez, the ambitious and determined son of Henry of Burgundy and Teresa of Leon. Young but fierce, Afonso has spent his life in the shadow of his mother's power, watching as she made decisions that threatened to reshape the kingdom and his place in it. Teresa, once a figure of strength, has drifted into dangerous alliances, one in particular with a nobleman named Fernão Pérez de Trava. Their bond, both political and personal, threatens to rob Afonso of the very inheritance that he believed was rightfully his. But Afonso will not let go so easily. The very idea of being denied his birthright, of being forced to live under the shadow of his mother's foreign allegiance, is an unbearable injustice. The stakes are high, far higher than any personal vendetta. The fate of Portugal is tied to this battle, to the outcome of this moment. If Afonso is to claim what is his, he must fight not only his mother's army, but the very structure of power that has held Portugal together until now. In the midst of this turmoil, the land trembles as the two forces, Afonso's loyal followers and the regents, prepare for battle. São Mamede, a field not far from their strongholds, is about to become the arena for a contest that will decide the future of this kingdom. In a few hours, Afonso Henriquez will face his own mother in a conflict that will set the tone for an entire empire's future. As the first light of dawn breaks across the battlefield, one question hangs in the air. Who will win this fight for power, and who will be left standing when the dust settles? The empire and the fate of a nation will rest on the outcome of this fateful confrontation. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I will take you through the fascinating timeline of the Portuguese Empire, from its humble beginnings to its rise as a global maritime power. We'll start with a gripping family conflict that set the stage for an empire, explore the epic battles and explorations that shaped its future, and finally, dive into its eventual decline and legacy. We'll journey through key moments like Afonso Henriquez's rise to power, the Portuguese Age of Discovery, and the empire's expansion across continents. But this story isn't just about lands conquered. It's about the human drama, ambition, and vision that drove the empire forward. Before we dive deeper, I want to hear from you. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter of history. If you're not ready to subscribe, we'd love to know why. Drop a comment and tell us what you'd like to see more of and what we can improve. Your feedback means a lot to us. Now, let's get started. In the midst of 12th century Europe, a young knight named Henry of Burgundy stood on the precipice of a decision that would shape the course of history, not just for himself, but for an entire empire yet to be born. His story begins not in the battlefields of distant lands, but in the rolling hills of Burgundy, a region of noble families, feuding dynasties, and a society fiercely tied to the land they ruled. The knight was not the son of a great ruler or heir to a vast fortune. Instead, he was the scion of a noble house that was slowly losing its grip on power in a continent gripped by feudal instability. At the time, Burgundy was embroiled in a battle for identity and survival. The Duchy of Burgundy, once a proud and powerful region within the Holy Roman Empire, was in a period of decline. Burgundy's noble families, including Henry's own, were locked in a deadlock of power struggles, with the French monarchy consolidating more authority. This created a sense of uncertainty for Henry. For someone born into this world, fame and security were elusive. The land that Henry called home, though steeped in history, offered little in terms of personal ambition. The feudal system, where power was fragmented between countless lords, made it difficult for a knight to rise beyond his station unless he was fortunate enough to be born into great wealth or power. Yet Henry's spirit was not one easily confined by the boundaries of Burgundy. He was born with a warrior's heart, raised on stories of chivalry, bravery, and loyalty. His life was spent at the crossroads of two worlds, the barracks of feudal Burgundy, where knights were born to serve under their liege lords, and the turbulent, dangerous reality of medieval warfare. But despite his noble birth, Henry was not heir to a vast estate. He would not inherit a duchy or a kingdom. Rather, like many knights of the time, his fortunes would be shaped by service, by taking up arms for others and hoping, perhaps, for a chance to claim glory through his sword. The question lingered: how would a knight like him make his mark on a world that had seemingly closed all doors to greatness? The answer came from the south, the Iberian Peninsula, a land of chaos and opportunity, a kingdom at the edges of Christendom where the Reconquista still raged and where Christian kings were desperate to push back the Muslim forces that had ruled much of Spain for centuries. It was here that King Afonso I of Leon and the emerging Portuguese crown called upon knights from across Europe to aid in the struggle. Portugal was a kingdom still in its youth, a realm struggling to define itself in a world dominated by larger Christian kingdoms. It was not yet the powerful empire it would become, but it had the promise of one, a promise of territory, wealth, and glory. For Henry, the call to arms was like a lifeline thrown across a sea of uncertainty. He saw an opportunity not only to prove his worth as a knight, but to forge something that would last, a legacy that could transcend the limitations of his birthplace. Portugal, with its strategic position, its potential for expansion, and its need for brave men willing to fight for the future, was the perfect place for someone like him. There, amidst the battles for land and faith, Henry could stake his claim to a future of his own making. But what was it about Portugal, a frontier kingdom with little to offer in terms of material wealth, that could tempt a knight like Henry to abandon the familiar courts and battlegrounds of Burgundy? The answer lies in the fierce individualism that defined knights during the medieval period. For Henry, this journey was not just about wealth, it was about freedom, the freedom to write his own story in the world's unfolding history. Portugal, unlike Burgundy, offered the chance to be part of something new, to create an empire from the ground up, where loyalty was not just to a distant monarch, but to a kingdom still forging its identity. The pull of such an opportunity was powerful. For Henry, the prospect of serving a Christian king in the face of overwhelming odds was not just a matter of duty. It was a chance to escape the political intrigues and confines of Burgundy and embrace the raw, uncertain promise of an unwritten future. Thus, in 1128, with the promise of glory and the allure of new conquest before him, Henry of Burgundy left the courts of France and ventured southward toward a small kingdom on the edge of the world where his destiny awaited. His decision would not just change his life, it would change the course of history itself, laying the foundation for a Portuguese empire that would one day stretch across the globe, reshaping the world as we know it. Before Henry of Burgundy could become the father of a future empire, before his name would be etched into the history of Portugal, he was merely another knight, a son born into the fractured feudal world of 12th century Burgundy, a land caught between larger powers, its destiny uncertain. But it wasn't just ambition that brought him across the Pyrenees to the shores of Portugal. It was something more, something raw and deeply human that defined his sense of identity and his need to carve out a place in history. Born into the Burgundian nobility in the early 12th century, Henry's family held modest but important titles. Burgundy, at the time, was a region in transition. Once a powerful, independent duchy, it had become subordinate to France. The French monarchy, under the Capetians, was growing in power and expanding its grip on the regions once governed by semi-independent dukes like those of Burgundy. The nobility of Burgundy, Henry's own family included, found themselves tied to the capricious whims of the French crown and often embroiled in competing loyalties to the Holy Roman Empire. It was a political mess, with fragmented power, shifting allegiances, and noble houses constantly vying for influence. From the age of 12 or 13, Henry would have been trained in the ways of chivalry, the art of war, and the nuances of courtly life. But his future would not be one of peaceful inheritance. His family, although noble, lacked the wealth and territorial holdings to guarantee him a place at the top of the feudal hierarchy. A nobleman's destiny was shaped not just by his family's power, but by his ability to prove himself in battle and allegiance, in an ever-changing landscape where personal ambition often dictated the course of one's life. Henry, perhaps more than most, saw the writing on the wall. In Burgundy, where status was tied to land and titles, there was little room for someone of his station to rise above the feudal system unless he could find an avenue that allowed him to forge his own path. For Henry, that path would come from a call to arms from a kingdom on the edge of the world, Portugal, a small and struggling kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, still fighting for its independence against the Muslim Moors to the south. The allure of Portugal, with its uncertain borders and its turbulent politics, was undeniable. For a knight like Henry, it offered freedom, freedom from the constrictions of the French court, freedom from the feudal struggles that bound him to Burgundy. Portugal, a land just beginning to define itself, held the promise of new beginnings, the possibility of land, title, and influence not granted by inheritance, but earned through action and loyalty to the king. Here, in this nascent kingdom, Henry could stake his claim to something more significant than a Burgundian title. He could carve out a place for himself in history. It was this spirit, this desire for personal achievement and legacy, that drove Henry to take the gamble. In 1128, when King Afonso I of Leon called upon knights across Europe to aid in the Reconquista and expand the reach of Christian kingdoms in Iberia, Henry saw his opportunity. He would leave behind Burgundy and journey to a new world where, as a knight, he could build something of substance, and perhaps even shape the course of history. In 1109, in the heart of a kingdom caught between Iberian feuds, religious wars, and the ever-changing tides of European politics, a child was born who would one day change the fate of nations. Afonso Henriquez, son of Henry of Burgundy and Teresa of Leon, came into the world as a product of political intrigue and a land that was just beginning to define itself, a land that was both a newly established county and an emerging kingdom. But who was this child, and what kind of ruler would he become? Born in the shadow of conflict, Afonso's early years were marked not by peace or prosperity, but by the constant presence of ambition, betrayal, and the fragile nature of power. His mother, Teresa, had ruled as the regent of Portugal, a kingdom that had just been carved out from the Kingdom of Leon. But Teresa's political alliances, including a growing bond with the Galician nobleman Fernão Pérez de Trava, created a rift between her and Afonso. This growing discord between mother and son would shape Afonso's view of leadership and rule. Afonso inherited more than land from his parents. He inherited the bitter realities of medieval politics, where family bonds often took second place to ambition and the quest for power. From his father, he inherited the spirit of a knight, a man who believed in forging his destiny through action rather than waiting for it to be handed to him. From his mother, Afonso inherited a shrewd understanding of governance, though it was one tempered by the challenges of political survival in a world where alliances were fragile and loyalty could change with the wind. But more than anything, Afonso's early life was defined by the turbulent politics of his kingdom. Portugal, although independent from Leon, was not yet stable. The nobility within Portugal was fractured, with many lords holding personal allegiances to their own interests rather than to the kingdom's unity. As a young man, Afonso found himself caught between his mother's regency and his growing desire for independence. As the Battle for São Mamede approached in 1128, Afonso's internal conflict came to a head. He was no longer just the son of a noble knight and a regent. He was a man on the brink of claiming his own destiny. Afonso's early years were filled with the foundational lessons of what it would take to become a ruler, the importance of military strength, the necessity of alliances, and the realization that the road to power was paved with betrayal as much as it was with loyalty. The young prince quickly learned that in this world, the pursuit of glory was often intertwined with the need to survive. And as he stood at the edge of war with his mother and her forces, Afonso understood that if he was to be the king of Portugal, he would have to forge his path with his own hands, amidst bloodshed, treachery, and a kingdom at the brink of collapse. In the years that followed, Afonso Henriques would go on to become not just a ruler, but a founder of an empire, shaping the destiny of a kingdom that would one day span oceans. But that legacy began not in the comfort of inherited wealth, but in the struggles of his youth, the ambition inherited from his father, and the political intrigue of his mother's reign. Afonso Henriquez's childhood was one of constant turmoil. Born in 1109, at a time when Portugal was a young kingdom, its future uncertain, Afonso's early years were marked by the sounds of battle and the ever-present spectre of invasion. His father, Henry of Burgundy, had claimed the county of Portugal as a reward for his service in the Reconquista. But this new territory, although promising, was anything but stable. Situated at the crossroads of Christian and Muslim territories, Portugal was constantly caught in the middle of a larger geopolitical struggle that spanned the entire Iberian Peninsula. In the south, the Moors had held sway over much of Iberia for centuries, and their control over Al-Andalus remained a thorn in the side of Christian kingdoms like Leon and Castile. Afonso's early life was spent in a kingdom that was separated by geography, but not by conflict. From a young age, he would have been exposed to the harsh reality of life on the frontiers, where the kingdom's borders were perpetually under threat. His education was not one of luxury or leisure. Portugal was a kingdom in its infancy, lacking the financial resources and manpower to sustain prolonged periods of peace. Instead, Afonso was raised to be a warrior king, one who would understand not just courtly manners and the importance of diplomacy, but also the fundamentals of warfare and strategy. Heir to a throne that was constantly vulnerable, Afonso would have been trained in battle as much as in governance. Afonso's early education included learning to ride and fight with the sword, spear, and bow, skills every nobleman needed to survive in the medieval world. But more than that, he learned the art of leadership. From his father, he inherited the practical lessons of war, how to lead men in battle, how to strategize under pressure, and how to calculate risks when faced with an uncertain future. His father, though a capable warrior, had never inherited a kingdom of his own. He had taken it through military conquest, a lesson that would be deeply ingrained in Afonso's character. To Afonso, leadership was synonymous with military prowess. It was a kingdom that could only survive if its ruler was a man of action and not one who lived behind the safety of court walls. Yet, Afonso's childhood was not only shaped by warfare, it was also defined by the complex relationship with his mother, Teresa. Afonso's relationship with his mother was one of emotional complexity. Teresa, though a capable regent and ruler of Portugal, was not simply a nurturing maternal figure. She was a ruler in her own right, holding political power that had been granted to her as the regent of a kingdom that had yet to stabilize. And while she undoubtedly loved her son, their relationship was fraught with the kind of political tension that marked the medieval world. In the beginning, Afonso admired his mother's strength. After all, Teresa was a woman who had held the reins of power in a kingdom threatened on all sides. Yet, as he grew older, Afonso began to see his mother in a different light. For Afonso, loyalty was not just a personal bond, it was a matter of survival for the kingdom. And when he saw his mother form a political alliance with Fernão Pérez de Trava, a powerful noble from Galicia, Afonso's world was thrown into turmoil. Teresa's growing relationship with Fernão was seen not just as a personal matter, but as a political betrayal. To Afonso, it represented a threat to his own claim to the throne and to the independence of Portugal. Was Afonso driven by jealousy or patriotism? Perhaps both. On one hand, he was a son who had been raised to believe that his birthright as ruler of Portugal was non-negotiable. On the other, he was a young man who saw the future of his kingdom being compromised by his mother's decisions. As Teresa's influence over the court grew, Afonso began to see her not just as a mother, but as a rival, a leader whose choices might prevent him from ever achieving the power and independence he desired for himself and for Portugal. This emotional conflict would culminate in a decisive moment in 1128, when Afonso, emboldened by his belief in his own destiny, faced off against his mother's forces at the Battle of São Mamede. But before this battle could happen, there were many smaller struggles, moments where Afonso's trust in his mother was tested, and his belief in the future of Portugal grew stronger. Teresa's growing political relationship with Fernão Pérez de Trava, a nobleman from Galicia, was not just a matter of romantic intrigue, but a strategic necessity. At the time, the political landscape of Portugal was precarious. Portugal's nobility was still fractured, with the kingdom's future in the balance. Teresa, though capable, could not rule alone. Her relationship with Fernão, whether personal or political, was essential in consolidating power and ensuring the kingdom's survival amidst increasing threats from both outside forces and internal dissent. For Teresa, this wasn't simply a matter of love. It was about securing military support and political stability in a kingdom that could easily have fallen to neighboring realms. In Fernão, Teresa saw not just a nobleman, but an ally with substantial land and influence, a figure who could help her protect Portugal's fragile independence from the looming power of Leon. Yet for Afonso, this relationship was seen as a betrayal of the bloodline, a compromise of Portugal's sovereignty in exchange for personal gain. What does this tell us about the medieval world? Power was never simply about bloodlines. It was about alliances, marriages, and strategic decisions that were often driven by the need to survive and expand. Teresa's choices, while perhaps pragmatic, highlighted the delicate balance that women in power had to strike between personal desires and political necessities. But for Afonso, the impact was clear. Portugal's future had become a game of alliances, and his mother's decisions were no longer the foundation he could rely on to build the future of the kingdom. The childhood of Afonso Henriques was not one of peace, but of constant tension, a life shaped by war, by political intrigue, and by his growing awareness that the path to power was never simple or clear. His relationship with Teresa was marked by ambivalence, torn between the loyalty he felt for his mother and the realization that his destiny lay not with her, but in a kingdom that needed a ruler of his own making. Afonso's early life was not just about learning the art of war or strategic diplomacy. It was about learning to see the world through the lens of power, to understand that loyalty could be fleeting and that the future of a kingdom was often shaped by betrayal and personal ambition. As Afonso Henriques matured, his relationship with his mother, Teresa, became increasingly strained. Teresa, once a powerful regent who navigated the intricacies of medieval politics with careful calculation, had begun to shift her allegiances in ways that deeply troubled her son. To Afonso, these alliances were not just political, they were personal betrayals, and they threatened the very future of the kingdom he believed was rightfully his. Afonso had grown up under the shadow of his mother's power. He had seen firsthand the challenges she faced in ruling a young, fragile kingdom at the edge of the Christian world. But as his mother's relationship with Fernão Pérez de Trava, a nobleman from Galicia, deepened, Afonso's trust in her began to erode. Teresa's affair with Fernão was not just a matter of personal loyalty, it was political. By aligning herself with one of the most influential nobles in Galicia, Teresa appeared to be distancing herself from the native Portuguese nobility, which had long been loyal to her. More importantly, Afonso saw this alliance as dangerous for the future of Portugal, a kingdom that had barely survived its first few decades and was now being pulled into the web of foreign influence. This wasn't just personal jealousy. For Afonso, his mother's actions were a direct threat to Portugal's independence. He had always been acutely aware of the precarious position in which his kingdom existed, caught between the Iberian Christian kingdoms to the north and the Muslim forces in the south. To Afonso, foreign influence, especially from Galicia, was the beginning of a domino effect that could lead to Portugal being swallowed by the larger powers around it. His feelings of betrayal were fueled by something deeper, a fear of losing control over the very kingdom that was his birthright. As he watched his mother's influence grow, Afonso realized that loyalty, in the medieval sense, was not only about familial bonds, but also about territorial security. Teresa's decisions, which he perceived as sacrificing Portugal's sovereignty for political gain, pushed Afonso to re-evaluate everything he had been taught about leadership and power. Afonso's resentment toward his mother was a catalyst for the larger political decisions he would make in the coming years. He began to see himself not just as a son, but as the protector of Portugal's future, someone who would have to take matters into his own hands if the kingdom was to survive. Afonso's feelings of betrayal cannot be understood without considering the larger political landscape of Iberia in the 12th century. The Iberian Peninsula was a patchwork of rival kingdoms, Leon, Castile, and Aragon, all fighting for dominance in a fragmented and often volatile environment. These kingdoms were locked in a constant struggle for land, influence, and control, while also facing the internal struggles of ruling over a fractured nobility. At the same time, the Reconquista, the Christian campaign to reclaim Iberian lands from the Moors, was still ongoing. The Muslim forces controlled large portions of the south, including Al-Andalus, and their presence remained a persistent threat to Christian dominance. For Afonso, this was not merely a distant political conflict. It was a central reality that shaped every decision he made. The Reconquista was not just about religious conquest. It was about the survival of Christian kingdoms in a land where Muslim power was still a formidable force. The kingdoms of Leon, Castile, and Aragon were constantly vying for territory, but they were also unstable. In Leon, the throne was often contested by rival factions, making it an unpredictable ally. Castile and Aragon were powerful, but both kingdoms were experiencing their own internal divisions. The political fragmentation of Iberia meant that Afonso could not afford to take anything for granted. The external threat of the Muslim kingdoms and the internal rivalries among Iberian Christian kingdoms put Afonso in a precarious position where every alliance, every political decision had to be carefully weighed. For Afonso Henriquez, the quest for independence was not just about family loyalty, it was about the future of Portugal itself. While his mother's growing ties to Fernão Pérez de Trava threatened to compromise the kingdom's autonomy, Afonso realized that true independence would require him to take bold action. The growing tension within the Iberian Peninsula meant that only a strong, unified kingdom could stand up to both internal rivals and external threats. Afonso knew that if he was to secure Portugal's future, he needed to create a united front. This was not just about seizing the throne from his mother. It was about building a kingdom that could withstand the pressures from all sides. His ambitions were rooted in a vision for Portugal as a strong, independent power in Iberia, not a kingdom controlled by foreign influences. To achieve this, Afonso began to gather support from the nobles of Portugal. Some had long been loyal to Teresa, but many were disillusioned by her increasing dependence on Galician and Leonese power. These nobles recognized that Afonso, with his clear vision for a sovereign Portugal, was the future. They understood that under Afonso's rule, Portugal could stand alone, united and powerful, without the need to lean on larger, more unstable neighbors. Afonso's growing political support came not just from his familial ties, but from his ability to inspire loyalty in a fractured kingdom. In the coming months, as Afonso moved to consolidate power, he understood that his rise would be complicated. There were still internal divisions to navigate, foreign threats to face, and the complex web of alliances between the Iberian Christian kingdoms to consider. But he was now convinced of one thing: Portugal's future depended not just on maintaining its borders, but on securing its independence. And if that meant defying his mother, Teresa, and taking matters into his own hands, Afonso was ready to do whatever it took. The weeks leading up to the Battle of São Mamede in 1128 were marked by a tension that was palpable, not just on the battlefield, but within the very heart of Portugal itself. The air in the kingdom was thick with suspicion, betrayal, and the growing realization that Afonso Henriquez was about to face the most important test of his life, a test not only of his military prowess, but of his destiny as a leader. Afonso, though young, was not untested in battle. He had already demonstrated his leadership capabilities during the years of conflict that defined his youth. But the Battle of São Mamede was different. It wasn't just a fight for land, it was a battle for the very soul of Portugal. And Afonso's thoughts in the days before, it must have been as much about the weight of his actions as they were about military tactics. His mother, Teresa, had long held power as the regent of Portugal, a role she had maintained with political savvy, even as her alliances with Fernão Pérez de Trava and the Galician nobility began to alienate her from the native Portuguese aristocracy. Afonso's resentment of her policies had simmered for years, but it was now ready to boil over. He could no longer coexist with the kingdom's dependence on foreign interests. In his eyes, Portugal's survival was at stake, its future dependent on strong, independent rule. In the days before the battle, Afonso's army, though smaller in number, was better positioned for guerrilla tactics. The terrain of São Mamede, located near Guimarães in northern Portugal, was ideal for quick strikes, making it difficult for Teresa's larger, more established forces to maneuver effectively. Afonso had spent years learning the land, an advantage that would prove crucial in the coming conflict. But beyond military strategy, he was also mentally prepared for the conflict. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. His youth, once seen as a potential weakness, was now an asset. He had nothing to lose in this battle, and the hunger for independence from his mother's rule drove him forward. Yet, Afonso must have known that this was more than just a military struggle. It was a personal one. He was preparing to face not just an army, but his mother herself, the very woman who had raised him, who had taught him the values of loyalty and family. The emotional stakes of this battle were impossible to ignore. Was he ready to destroy the only authority he had ever known? Would this battle mark the end of his relationship with Teresa, not just as a mother, but as a political figure in his life? In the quiet before the storm, Afonso's thoughts must have turned inward. He was a man divided, determined to secure Portugal's future, but torn by the knowledge that the price of his victory would be immense. Yet he also knew that to secure Portugal's independence, to free it from the influence of Galicia and Leon, he had to act. There was no turning back. On June 24th, 1128, Afonso, Henriquez's forces, faced Teresa's at São Mamede. The terrain was a crucial factor in determining the outcome of the battle. The land around Guimarães was hilly, rough, and filled with dense woodland, which favored the more mobile and agile forces of Afonso. Unlike Teresa's more heavily fortified and less flexible army, Afonso's men were prepared for the sharp skirmishes and surprise attacks that the terrain allowed. The narrow paths and wooded areas limited the effectiveness of Teresa's larger force, forcing her to fight on Afonso's terms. Afonso's forces, although fewer in number, used their superior knowledge of the land to great effect. They engaged in hit-and-run tactics, using the natural terrain to shield their movements and confuse Teresa's larger, less mobile forces. The battle was not decisive in a single charge. Instead, it was a grinding conflict, where Afonso's smaller force gradually wore down Teresa's army by exploiting weaknesses in her positioning. Key players in the battle included Afonso's loyal commanders, such as Paio Pérez Correa, who was instrumental in executing Afonso's tactical vision. On the opposing side, Fernão Pérez de Trava, a figure of considerable influence, led Teresa's forces. Yet, despite his experience, Fernão's army was disjointed, uncoordinated, and unable to match the fluidity of Afonso's attacks. As the hours wore on, it became apparent that Afonso's forces had gained the upper hand. The victory was not the result of sheer force, but of strategic brilliance, and the distrust and political fragmentation within Teresa's ranks. The tactical flexibility of Afonso's forces ensured that, despite being outnumbered, they could outmaneuver the heavier forces of Teresa and her Galician allies. The battle ended with a clear victory for Afonso Henriquez, but the psychological toll of the conflict on both Afonso and Teresa would be far-reaching. For Afonso, the victory was bittersweet. Defeating his mother, the very woman who had given him life, had not been a simple political maneuver. It was a personal reckoning. No longer could he look at Teresa simply as his mother, but as the former ruler of Portugal, a woman whose authority he had just toppled. There was no celebration in his victory, only the cold understanding that he had begun his journey to power at a great cost. For Teresa, the consequences were devastating. She had lost not just a battle, but her grip on power. Her forces, once formidable, had been shattered, and her influence within Portugal was now in question. More than just the end of her reign, the battle represented a loss of legacy. Her relationship with Afonso, once a bond of mutual respect, was now irreparably fractured. In the aftermath of the battle, it was unclear what role she would play in the future of Portugal. Was this the end of Teresa's reign? Yes, but it was also the beginning of something much larger. For Afonso, this victory marked the first step in his evolution from prince to king. Yet the true weight of leadership was only beginning to sink in. The burden of rule would weigh heavily on him in the years to come, and the real test for Afonso had yet to unfold. Was Afonso prepared for the weight of leadership after his victory? The question would linger as he stepped into the role of king, a role that demanded not just military prowess, but political acumen, vision, and the ability to govern a fractured, turbulent kingdom. Afonso had won the battle, but now, the greater struggle for Portugal's future was about to begin. By 1130, Afonso Henriques had already demonstrated his military prowess, securing his victory over his mother, Teresa, at the Battle of São Mamede. However, despite his triumph, Afonso was faced with the monumental task of consolidating his power and establishing his legitimacy as King of Portugal. But declaring himself king wasn't as simple as it seemed. The political ramifications of his actions, both internal and external, were immense, and his rise to power was far from secure. Afonso's actions had ruffled the feathers of many in Portugal and beyond. While the Portuguese nobility had largely supported him during the battle, Afonso had yet to win the recognition of the Church, or the King of Leon, Alfonso VII, who viewed Afonso's rise as a threat to his own authority. Afonso's victory, though significant, was still a military conquest without the political stability that true legitimacy could provide. Without recognition from both the Church and neighboring Christian kingdoms, Afonso's claim to the throne would remain tenuous, subject to challenge at any moment. The Kingdom of Leon, the largest Christian kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, was a significant power in Iberian politics. Afonso's claim was now being scrutinized by Alfonso VII, who had long held the title of Emperor of all Spain, and who saw Afonso's actions as a threat to his own control over the Iberian Peninsula. For Afonso, securing the recognition of Leon was paramount, but it was not only military success that could grant him this status, it was the Church's approval. Despite his success on the battlefield, Afonso knew that papal recognition was essential for two reasons: to legitimize his rule and to bolster his claim against external threats. The Pope could provide Afonso with the divine authority needed to ensure the stability of his reign in a kingdom that had long been dominated by foreign influence. Thus, Afonso was not only fighting against his mother and the Galician nobility, but also for his future recognition as the rightful king of Portugal. Religion had always played a central role in the lives of medieval rulers. A king's legitimacy in 12th century Europe wasn't simply a matter of inheritance or military victory. It was about the divine right to rule. For Afonso Henriques, gaining papal recognition was not only a matter of securing his position in Portugal, but also about positioning himself within the wider framework of Christian Europe. Without papal approval, Afonso could not be considered a legitimate ruler by the wider Christian world, and his throne would remain in jeopardy. The Pope's endorsement was the key to transforming Afonso's victory from a military conquest into a divinely ordained reign. By 1130, Pope Innocent II had been dealing with political instability within the papacy and the wider church. However, as Afonso presented himself as a crusader for Christian unity, Pope Innocent II saw an opportunity to support Afonso, his campaign to strengthen Christian authority in Iberia. This was particularly appealing in light of the Reconquista, the Christian campaign to reclaim territories from the Muslims in the south. Afonso positioned himself not just as a king, but as a crusader king, someone who would extend the Christian kingdom against the Muslim forces in southern Iberia. Papal support gave Afonso more than just spiritual authority. It provided a moral justification for his rise, giving him the right to claim the throne in the eyes of both his people and his enemies. The Pope's recognition did more than secure Afonso's territorial integrity. It allowed him to present himself as the defender of Christendom, ensuring that Portugal's sovereignty would be seen as part of the larger Christian cause. In medieval Europe, being recognized by the Pope meant much more than securing political power. For Afonso, it was about securing the moral high ground. The Pope's approval was not just a formality, it was an essential part of the political and religious landscape of the time. To be crowned by the Pope was to be chosen by God, and this bestowed an unparalleled level of legitimacy. Afonso's reign was no longer just a matter of military conquest. It was now divinely sanctioned. This recognition by the Pope was also a direct challenge to the other Iberian kingdoms. Leon, Castile, and Aragon were all Christian kingdoms with their own political agendas, and their recognition of Afonso as a legitimate ruler was crucial for his survival. The Pope's endorsement ensured that Afonso's claim was solidified in the eyes of the other Christian kingdoms of Iberia. It was a direct signal that Afonso was not only a military leader, but a divinely sanctioned ruler, one who could claim to rule by God's will. This was the foundation of Afonso's legitimacy. In the medieval world, divine right was the ultimate source of political power, and Afonso's victory in securing the papal blessing allowed him to wield this divine legitimacy throughout his reign. It also allowed him to navigate the complex web of European politics, ensuring that Portugal would not be seen as a kingdom on the fringes of Christendom, but as a legitimate, sovereign Christian state. By the time Pope Innocent II confirmed Afonso as king of Portugal in 1130, Afonso had solidified his claim to the throne. But this recognition wasn't just political, it was divinely ordained. With papal approval, Afonso could now present himself as the rightful ruler of Portugal, free from the foreign influences that had threatened the kingdom's sovereignty. Afonso's use of religion and divine right to justify his rule was a crucial element of his success. It provided the moral foundation for his reign and ensured that Portugal would stand as a unified, independent Christian kingdom, firmly rooted in the authority of God and the papal church. The path ahead for Afonso was not easy. He would face more challenges, both from within his kingdom and from his powerful neighbors. But with the Pope's blessing, he had secured the legitimacy that would ensure the future of Portugal. When Afonso Henriques was crowned King of Portugal on December 25th, 1139, it was more than a simple political act. It was the culmination of years of military conquest, personal sacrifice, and religious symbolism. The coronation wasn't merely a symbol of his victory over his mother, Teresa, or the military elite. It was the moment when Afonso, who had defeated enemies both within and outside the kingdom, was officially anointed not only by the people of Portugal, but by God himself. This divine moment carried deep spiritual significance, one that transcended the political reality of a kingdom fighting for survival. Afonso's coronation was framed in the context of the legend of the Battle of Albuquerque, a legendary event in 1139, where Afonso was said to have had a vision of Christ, assuring him of victory and divinely choosing him to lead the kingdom. This vision was more than a spiritual affirmation. It was a political necessity. In a world where kingship was deeply tied to divine right, Afonso's legitimacy rested not just on his military triumphs, but on the belief that his rule was ordained by God. The papal confirmation that would follow further entrenched this divine narrative, aligning Afonso with the sacred mission of defending Christianity in the Iberian Peninsula. His coronation wasn't just a formal event, it was the moment when Portugal's identity was linked to Afonso's divine mission. The symbolism of his kingship was powerful. Afonso wasn't simply the ruler of a land, he was the chosen one, tasked with uniting the Christian world against the Muslims to the south. This sense of divine purpose would fuel his actions throughout his reign, guiding his decisions from military campaigns to political alliances. Afonso's coronation was also a statement of power, not just for himself, but for Portugal. It signified the birth of a new Christian kingdom, a kingdom that would be centered on religion and the rightful rule of a king believed to have been chosen by God. This was not just a kingdom of political necessity, but a kingdom with a divine mission, one that would shape the future of Christian Europe. With the crown now placed upon his head, Afonso Henriquez faced a new, even more daunting challenge: how to consolidate power in a kingdom that was still in its infancy, racked with internal strife and threatened by external forces. His coronation was a symbolic victory, but it was only the beginning of a complex and fragile journey to establish his reign. The political environment Afonso inherited was anything but stable. While his victory over his mother in São Mamede had eliminated one major threat, there were still rival factions within the kingdom: loyalists to Teresa and the Galician nobles who had supported her. These nobles, despite Afonso's victory, still held substantial power and influence, and Afonso had to assert control over them. The loyalty of the Portuguese aristocracy was anything but guaranteed. Afonso's reign could easily be undermined by rival nobles who viewed him as an outsider, especially as his mother's influence had been strong in some regions. In addition to internal challenges, Afonso had to contend with the powerful kingdom of Leon under Alfonso VII, who was not willing to let Afonso claim independence without resistance. To gain recognition and ensure Portugal's survival, Afonso first needed to solidify his sovereignty within the region. This meant forging alliances with Castile and other Christian kingdoms, while balancing the fragile relationships within his own court. Afonso's consolidation of power wasn't just about winning battles, it was also about securing alliances. Marriage to Beatrice of Castile in 1139 was a strategic move, strengthening his claim and ensuring support from one of the most powerful kingdoms in Iberia. Diplomacy played a crucial role in his early reign, as Afonso sought to maintain stable relations with his neighbors while dealing with the internal nobility. The wars of consolidation were fierce and unrelenting. The Muslim threat in the south remained pressing, with the Almohads still holding a significant portion of Iberia. Afonso's military campaigns against the Moors were framed as part of the larger Christian Reconquista, giving his rule a religious mandate. His wars, however, were not just military conquests. They were statements of power, each victory reinforcing Afonso's position as the undisputed ruler of Portugal. As Afonso navigated the complexities of rule, one question remained at the heart of his reign. Was his kingship about national unity, or was it about securing his own legacy? The answer, of course, was both. But how Afonso balanced these competing forces would define his rule. On the one hand, Afonso's vision for Portugal was undeniably centered on national unity. He sought to create a strong, unified kingdom, one that could stand against both internal dissent and external threats. His efforts to consolidate power through alliances, his defense of the Christian faith, and his drive to expand Portugal's borders all pointed to a ruler committed to the long-term stability of his kingdom. However, Afonso's personal legacy was equally important to him. His rise to power was marked by a determined ambition to carve out his own place in history, and this ambition was intertwined with the political necessity of uniting Portugal. His military success, his spiritual vision, and his political acumen were all part of a larger narrative, one that saw him not only as a ruler, but as a founder, the man who would lay the foundations for a new, independent Portugal. In the balance between personal ambition and national unity, Afonso showed a remarkable ability to navigate both. His ambition did not drive him to sacrifice the kingdom for personal gain. Instead, he used his personal goals to drive the growth and security of Portugal. Every decision he made, from his military campaigns to his political alliances, was driven by his belief that Portugal's future was inextricably linked to his own legacy. For Afonso, there was no distinction between the kingdom's future and his own place in history. Prince Henry of Portugal, known later as Henry the Navigator, was driven by a complex set of motivations, each tied to the larger political landscape of 15th century Iberia and his own personal aspirations. While we know him for his pivotal role in shaping the age of exploration, his motivations were not rooted solely in religious zeal or a desire for glory, although these were significant factors. Prince Henry's vision for Portugal's future was deeply influenced by pragmatic concerns, like the desire for economic prosperity and national security. Born in 1394, Henry was the third son of King John I of Portugal, which placed him in a precarious position. Without the prospect of inheriting the throne, he had to find another path to power and legacy. While his brothers were positioned to rule, Henry had the foresight to recognize that Portugal, a relatively small and poor kingdom, needed to secure its future by looking outward. This vision would propel him toward exploration, not as an act of blind ambition, but as a strategic necessity. The economic benefits of exploration were undeniable. Portugal had limited resources and was surrounded by rival powers, Castile, Aragon, and the expanding Ottoman Empire. To compete, Portugal needed to secure its place in global trade, and that meant controlling trade routes to Africa, the East Indies, and beyond. The spices, gold, and ivory that Henry hoped to access were crucial to Portugal's economic survival. These new trade routes would not only ensure economic dominance, but also provide a steady stream of wealth to fund future military campaigns. But it wasn't just about money. Prince Henry was also deeply motivated by religion. The Reconquista, which had ended just a few decades before his birth, left a powerful legacy of Christian zeal across the Iberian Peninsula. Henry, like many of his contemporaries, was determined to extend Christianity across the seas, pushing Muslim influence out of Africa and beyond. The cross wasn't just a symbol for Henry, it was the mission behind his entire vision. Through exploration, he sought to create an empire that could defend Christianity against the growing influence of the Muslim world, while expanding Portugal's religious and political reach across the globe. To bring his ambitious vision to life, Prince Henry needed more than just ships and sailors. He needed a center of learning and innovation. In 1419, he established the School of Navigation at Sagres, a remote coastal town located at the southern tip of Portugal. Sagres would not only become the epicenter of Portugal's maritime endeavors, it would also serve as the foundation of the country's empire. The location of Sagres was symbolic. Perched on the edge of the known world, it embodied Henry's vision of Portugal as the gateway to new lands, an outpost that could connect Europe to the farthest reaches of Africa and the East. But Sagres wasn't just about location, it was about innovation. Henry brought together the best cartographers, shipbuilders, and astronomers of the time. Men like Gil Eons and Diogo Cão were instrumental in developing new navigation techniques, most notably the caravel, a fast and maneuverable ship that was capable of sailing long distances. The school of navigation also fostered an intellectual culture that would reshape how Europeans understood the world. It was here that scientific advances in map-making, navigation, and astronomy helped expand the boundaries of the known world. The ideas generated at Sagres would be critical not just for Portugal, but for all of Europe's maritime nations, paving the way for global exploration. But Sagres was more than just a center for technical innovation. It was where Henry's visionary leadership truly shone. He was not merely a prince delegating to experts. He was actively engaged in the process, constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible. His passion for exploration was infectious, and it attracted the best minds of the era: astrologers, navigators, and shipwrights, all working toward a common goal: to unlock the secrets of the sea. What drove Prince Henry? Was he simply an ambitious prince, seeking immortality through exploration? Or was he a true visionary, trying to secure Portugal's future as a global power? In many ways, he was both. Henry's actions were undeniably ambitious. His quest to expand Portugal's borders wasn't just about territory. It was about creating a legacy. As the third son, he had no claim to the throne and knew his future lay in forging something lasting. The age of exploration was the perfect vehicle for him to assert his authority, not just as a prince, but as the architect of a new, more powerful Portugal. However, Henry was also a visionary, one of the first in European history to see exploration as not just a way to expand territorial holdings, but as a strategy to reshape the world. His goal wasn't only economic gain, but the creation of a Portuguese empire that would lead the way for centuries to come. His motivations were deeply tied to his national vision: to make Portugal not just a kingdom, but a global power that would influence trade, religion, and international politics. His combination of personal ambition and long-term vision meant he saw exploration as both a personal mission and a national necessity. He was not just a pragmatic ruler trying to secure wealth for his kingdom. He was the man who would lay the foundation for Portugal's future as a global empire, a future that would secure his name as one of the great visionary rulers in history. By the early 15th century, Portugal was on the brink of a transformation that would see it dominate the seas for centuries. This transformation, however, was not solely due to the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, but also to the incredible technological advancements that allowed Portugal's navy to become the most powerful in Europe. At the heart of this innovation was the caravel, a ship that would forever change the way humans viewed the world and its waters. Before the caravel, European ships were primarily designed for shorter voyages in calm waters, such as the Mediterranean. These ships, such as the cog and galley, were large and strong, but lacked the flexibility required for long-distance exploration. They were often too bulky and slow, unable to navigate the open seas or the coastal waters of Africa and the Americas. As Portugal set its sights on new territories in Africa and the East, a new kind of ship was needed, one that could withstand the unpredictable Atlantic Ocean and venture into unexplored territories. The caravel was the answer. Unlike previous ship designs, the caravel was a smaller, lighter vessel, built to be both durable and highly maneuverable. Its lateen sails, which were triangular rather than the square sails used by earlier ships, allowed it to sail into the wind more effectively. This was crucial for long-distance voyages across the Atlantic and down the coast of Africa. The caravel could sail against the wind, tack, and navigate unfamiliar and often dangerous waters that had previously been impassable for other ships. This newfound ability to sail against the wind was a technological breakthrough. It allowed Portuguese navigators to chart the coasts of West Africa, penetrate deeper into the Atlantic Ocean, and eventually reach the Indian Ocean, a feat that would be impossible with the traditional Mediterranean vessels. The caravel's design made it the perfect ship for exploration, but its versatility also made it an excellent tool for trade, military conquest, and long-term colonial expansion. Moreover, the caravel's shallow draft, its ability to sail in shallow waters, enabled Portuguese explorers to venture into new harbors and coastlines that were previously inaccessible. It could navigate coastal waters, map out new territories, and engage in trade in ways that larger, more cumbersome ships simply couldn't. This was crucial for establishing Portuguese control over vital maritime routes and laying the foundation for the Portuguese Empire that would stretch across the globe. Though the caravel was a remarkable vessel, it was Prince Henry's vision that truly brought this innovation to life. Born in 1394, Henry was the third son of King John I of Portugal. With no claim to the throne, his path to power lay in creating his own legacy, one that would secure Portugal's future as a global maritime power. Henry was not just a patron of exploration, he was the driving force behind its development. He understood that Portugal's survival and its ability to compete with larger, wealthier nations like Castile and Aragon depended on expanding beyond its borders and finding new trade routes. But his vision went beyond just acquiring wealth. It was about creating a Portuguese empire founded on Christian principles and bolstered by economic prosperity. Prince Henry's vision was not limited to a small kingdom on the edge of Europe. It was the foundation for a global empire that would span continents. His patronage of maritime innovation and his establishment of the School of Navigation in 1419 allowed Portugal to gather the best navigators, cartographers, and shipbuilders in Europe. With Henry's investment, the caravel was created as the most advanced ship of its time, capable of withstanding the harsh conditions of the Atlantic Ocean and exploring the unknown regions of the African coast, the Indian Ocean, and eventually the Americas. Henry's leadership and his commitment to maritime exploration helped build a network of explorers like Gil Eanes, Bartolomeo Dias, and Vasco da Gama, who would continue to push the boundaries of what was possible at sea. The caravel was the tool, but Henry was the visionary who saw the potential of the seas and worked tirelessly to develop the means to dominate them. The caravel's contribution to Portugal's maritime empire cannot be overstated. It allowed Portugal to not only map out uncharted territories, but also to establish dominance over the Atlantic trade routes. Prince Henry's investment in the caravel gave Portugal a fleet that could sail farther than any other nation in Europe, reaching the West African coast, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually reaching India and Brazil. The caravel was also the vessel that allowed Portuguese explorers to carve out a global network of colonies, including the Azores, Madeira, and parts of Brazil. It enabled Portugal to create a system of trade and colonial power that stretched across continents, establishing the Portuguese Empire as one of the first global maritime empires. However, the question remains, was it the caravel itself, or Prince Henry's vision, that enabled Portugal's domination of the seas? The truth lies in a combination of both. While the caravel itself was a technological marvel, it was Prince Henry's foresight, his understanding that exploration was not just about sailing into the unknown, but about securing a legacy and Portugal's future as a global power, that made the caravel's success possible. By the time Prince Henry the Navigator set his sights on Africa, Portugal had already established a tradition of exploration, driven by both economic need and religious ambition. The early voyages down the coast of Africa, beginning in 1415, were not simply about mapping uncharted territories. These expeditions laid the foundation for a global empire that would dominate trade, politics, and culture for centuries. But the story of the first Portuguese voyages is far from simple. It is tied to Portugal's strategic survival and its need to secure trade routes and wealth. The African coast offered much more than land and people. It offered control of the vital spice routes, gold, and other precious commodities. Prince Henry understood that the key to Portugal's prosperity lay not just in expansion, but in the establishment of trade routes that could connect the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian Ocean. The first Portuguese voyages, led by the finest navigators and explorers of the time, began the work of mapping this coast, ultimately leading to the Portuguese establishment of fortresses and trade posts along the West African coast. In 1415, after the conquest of Ceuta, Prince Henry's attention turned southward to the Atlantic Ocean. The Portuguese began venturing farther down the African coastline, reaching as far as Cape Bojador, a notorious landmark that had previously stymied European sailors for centuries. The caravels they used, designed for highly maneuverable and long-distance voyages, allowed the Portuguese to sail against the wind, opening up previously unexplored maritime routes. These voyages did not just lay the groundwork for trade, they fundamentally altered how the world engaged with the African continent, transforming Portugal into a major economic and colonial power. But the Portuguese didn't just explore for trade. They were driven by the idea of religious conquest as well. The same fervor that had fueled the Reconquista against the Moors in Iberia now spurred Portuguese sailors to bring Christianity to far-flung shores, setting the stage for a global missionary presence that would expand throughout the Indian Ocean and beyond. The conquest of Ceuta in 1415 marked a defining moment in the history of Portuguese expansion. It was not merely a military victory, it was a political and religious statement. Ceuta, located at the northern tip of Africa, across from Gibraltar, had long been a key trading port controlled by the Moors. It was rich with economic resources and was vital for controlling the passage between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Portugal's seizure of Ceuta was a bold step, marking the first major Portuguese foothold in North Africa and the Mediterranean. But it was also an event that symbolized the continuation of the Christian crusade that had characterized the Reconquista. For Prince Henry, the conquest of Ceuta held profound religious significance. It was framed as a Christian crusade, akin to the earlier campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula, and was seen as a divine mission to spread Christianity to Muslim-dominated regions. This was not just a military conquest. It was a moral duty that reinforced Portugal's position as a Christian power at the crossroads of Europe and Africa. The idea that Christianity should expand into the non-Christian world was central to Portugal's goals, and Ceuta became the first step in that mission. On the other hand, the strategic importance of Ceuta for Portugal cannot be understated. Its location was vital for controlling the Mediterranean trade routes, especially those linking Europe to the wealth of Africa and the East. By taking control of Ceuta, Portugal effectively blocked access to one of the key Mediterranean ports for Muslim powers, while securing a military presence in North Africa that would eventually enable Portuguese domination of key African trade routes. The immediate effects of the conquest of Ceuta were profound. Not only did it provide Portugal with a critical military stronghold in North Africa, but it also opened up new trade routes and ensured Portuguese control over maritime traffic through the Strait of Gibraltar. For the Portuguese, this meant access to the wealth of North Africa, including gold and spices. Ceuta became a base for further expansion into Africa, where Portuguese traders and missionaries would eventually establish colonies and fortresses along the West African coast. In the long term, the conquest of Ceuta played a key role in the development of the Portuguese Empire. It provided Portugal with a crucial base for exploring Africa, and it marked the beginning of a larger global colonial effort. Over the next few decades, Portuguese explorers and settlers would move down the coast of Africa, eventually reaching the Cape of Good Hope and pushing eastward into the Indian Ocean. The wealth generated by Portugal's African empire would fund further exploration and military campaigns, transforming Portugal into a global superpower for centuries. The capture of Ceuta in 1415 was both a religious conquest and a strategic military move for Portugal. From a religious perspective, the capture of Ceuta symbolized the continuation of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian struggle to reclaim Iberian lands from Muslim rule. Ceuta, a heavily fortified city, was seen as the gateway between the Christian and Muslim worlds, and its capture by Portugal represented a victory for Christianity and a reassertion of Christian control in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Strategically, Ceuta was vital for controlling maritime traffic between Europe and Africa. Its position at the entrance of the Mediterranean made it a critical naval base for further Portuguese exploration and imperial expansion. With Ceuta in their hands, the Portuguese could now push further down the African coast, establish colonies, and dominate trade routes that were previously controlled by Muslim powers. Ceuta was a powerful symbol of Portuguese superiority, both religiously and militarily, and it would serve as the springboard for Portugal's maritime dominance in the centuries to follow. In the early 15th century, the world beyond the Strait of Gibraltar was largely unknown, a place where myth and reality intertwined, creating a mysterious, almost terrifying frontier. For the Portuguese sailors attempting to push south along the African coast, one landmark stood as the ultimate test of their courage and resolve: Cape Bojador. This seemingly inconspicuous cape on the northwest African coast was imbued with a mystique that made it appear as the edge of the world, a threshold beyond which lay the unknown, a place filled with supernatural dangers. To the medieval mind, the world had limits. Beyond the familiar shores of Europe and North Africa lay an abyss, a sea so treacherous that ships disappeared, swallowed by the monstrous creatures of legend. The superstitions surrounding Cape Bojador were rooted in ancient European fears, fueled by the idea that beyond the point where the Mediterranean met the Atlantic, there were dangers not only in the weather, but in the very fabric of the world itself. The belief in sea monsters, the idea that the world's edge was marked by unseen terrors, made this section of the African coast not just a physical barrier, but a psychological one. Yet, it wasn't just superstition that made Cape Bojador so terrifying. The Atlantic Ocean, with its unpredictable winds and hidden reefs, presented a physical challenge that few had the courage to face. These waters were far more dangerous than the relatively calm seas of the Mediterranean. To cross Cape Bojador required not only mastery of the seas, but mastery over fear itself. For years, no sailor dared to venture beyond the Cape, and for good reason. Many had set out to pass it, and had returned defeated, or had vanished entirely. What then drove the Portuguese sailors to continue pushing south, despite the superstitions, the fear of the unknown, and the hardships they faced? It was a blend of determination and vision. Prince Henry the Navigator recognized that the future of Portugal lay beyond the Cape, both in trade and the spread of Christianity. These sailors were not only explorers, they were pioneers of Portugal's future as a global power. Faith and ambition kept them going, but perhaps it was their psychological resilience, their belief in the possibility of discovery, that pushed them to defy the terrifying unknown. In 1434, Gil Eanes, a Portuguese navigator, became the first to successfully cross Cape Bojador, overcoming the physical and psychological barriers that had thwarted so many before him. This victory was not just a geographic achievement, it was a triumph of human willpower over fear, superstition, and the perceived limits of the world. Eanes's successful passage beyond the Cape marked a shift, not only in the history of exploration, but also in the very nature of human ambition. The challenges faced by Aines were immense. The weather alone presented constant challenges, from turbulent winds to violent storms. The Atlantic Ocean's currents were unpredictable, and the sailors often found themselves battling powerful forces of nature. Yet, it was not just the physical environment that posed a challenge, it was the psychological weight of crossing the unknown. The idea of venturing beyond Cape Bojador had been ingrained in the minds of sailors as a point of no return, a place where many had lost their courage, their lives, or both. To pass this point was to defy centuries of superstition and myth. For Eanes, crossing the Cape wasn't just about discovering new lands, it was about overcoming the deep-seated fears that had held back generations of explorers. The feeling of passing that point was likely a mix of relief, triumph, and amazement. It was a geographical achievement, yes, but it was also the conquering of a fear, one that had gripped not just Portuguese sailors, but European society as a whole. The world was no longer flat, and the unknown was no longer a barrier to human progress. This was the beginning of a new era of exploration, one that would reshape the world. What was required for these early explorers to keep pushing forward, despite the superstitions and the harsh conditions they faced? It wasn't just technological advancement, it was an incredible psychological resilience that allowed them to see the world not as an edge, but as an endless possibility. For these sailors, the act of exploration was as much about internal courage as it was about external discovery. Their psychological resilience came from a visionary mission. Portugal needed to secure its place in the world, not only as a maritime power, but as a Christian empire. The belief that their journey was tied to a greater purpose, to spread Christianity, to open new trade routes, to establish Portugal's empire, was perhaps the greatest motivator. It was this psychological drive, this inner fortitude, that allowed these explorers to break free of their doubts, fears, and the terrifying myths that had defined their world. When Eanes crossed Cape Bojador in 1434, it was not simply a moment in Portuguese history. It was a turning point in the history of exploration. It marked the moment when the age of discovery truly began to take shape. The passing of the Cape was no longer about charting unknown waters. It was about the psychological breaking down of boundaries, both physical and mental, that had for so long restricted human knowledge of the world. This moment signified more than just the passage of a ship. It was the crossing of the boundary of human belief. By passing Cape Bojador, Eanes opened the door to the exploration of Africa, the Indian Ocean, and ultimately the New World. It was no longer just about geography. It was about human resilience, innovation, and the unshakable belief that the world was meant to be discovered, no matter the cost. As Portugal embarked on its quest to control the seas and expand its influence in the Atlantic world, the first footholds in Africa weren't simply military or territorial conquests. They were small but strategic trading posts, established with a clear economic purpose: to access the wealth of Africa and lay the groundwork for a powerful maritime empire. These posts, scattered along the coast from Morocco to the Gold Coast, were the starting point for what would become one of the most powerful and far-reaching empires of the age of exploration. The Portuguese first planted their flag on the African continent at Arzilla in 1419, followed by Guerre in 1444, and eventually the powerful outpost at São Jorge de Mina, modern Elmina, in 1482. located along the Gold Coast of Africa, present-day Ghana. These were not just military outposts, they were integral to Portugal's economic expansion, acting as hubs of trade where gold, ivory, and other precious resources from the African interior were exchanged for European goods like textiles, metalwork, and alcohol. What made these early Portuguese trading posts so critical was their ability to serve as economic hubs. Portugal's geographic location on the Iberian Peninsula meant it was well placed to become the gateway between Europe and the newly discovered lands of Africa and eventually Asia. With these posts, Portugal gained access to Africa's resources, primarily gold from the inland kingdoms like the Mali Empire and ivory from the deep interior. This trade would help finance Portugal's expansion and support its increasingly powerful naval fleet, which would later dominate the Indian Ocean and the Far East. These posts were also military outposts, crucial for protecting Portuguese interests in the region. They were not temporary settlements, as some might think, but permanent fixtures that laid the foundation for an empire. The Portuguese established fortified castles, complete with garrisons to guard the valuable trade routes and defend against rival powers, notably the Spanish, the French, and even the Ottomans, who were expanding their influence at the time. By the end of the 15th century, these Portuguese trading posts had become far more than just military outposts or small-scale trading stations. They became the lifeblood of the Portuguese economy, connecting Europe to Africa and eventually the East. Their influence was not confined to local trade. These posts were central to the development of a global economic network. The Portuguese were among the first to recognize the immense wealth that could be generated by controlling trade routes. The Gold Coast, rich in precious metals, and the ivory trade made these outposts vital economic engines for Portugal. Ivory, a luxury item in Europe, was in high demand, while gold provided the necessary currency to finance Portugal's naval expeditions into the Indian Ocean. These outposts also provided slaves, who were used both in Africa and later transported to the New World, marking the beginning of Portugal's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. The wealth pouring into Portugal from these trading posts funded further exploration and expansion. It allowed Portugal to build a formidable navy, which would go on to explore the Indian Ocean, establish trade routes with Asia, and create colonial outposts in Brazil. As such, the trading posts were the first step in building a global empire that would span Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Even though Portugal wasn't yet a fully fledged colonial empire, the capitalistic nature of its empire began to take shape with these early trading posts. The Portuguese didn't simply want to settle land. They were establishing economic outposts with the goal of generating profit from trade and resources. Unlike the later imperial powers, such as Britain or Spain, whose colonies were based on a blend of feudal landholding and state-driven economies, Portugal's approach was rooted in mercantilism, the idea that the wealth of a nation was best achieved through controlled trade and the acquisition of precious resources. The trading posts reflected this emerging capitalist model in several key ways. They were economic zones focused on the exchange of goods for profit, where Portuguese merchants and traders operated with a singular goal: wealth generation. These outposts were the precursor to modern capitalism, where private merchants, state-supported ventures, and global trade intersected. Through these outposts, the Portuguese were able to secure critical commodities that became the foundation of their empire's wealth, fueling a capitalist economy long before the term had come into widespread use. These trading posts also served as crucial nodes in the wider global economy, serving as intermediaries between the African interior and the rest of the world. The Portuguese were among the first to exploit Africa's resources, and this exploitation was a key driver of early modern global capitalism. By controlling trade routes and establishing economic dominance, the Portuguese laid the groundwork for the later rise of global capitalist empires in the 16th century. The early Portuguese trading posts were far more than just outposts or temporary settlements. They were the foundation of Portugal's maritime empire, crucial for the development of global trade and capitalism. These small, fortified settlements marked the beginning of Portugal's economic empire, establishing the country as a central player in the global economy for centuries. As the Portuguese pushed further into Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the Americas, these trading posts became more than just military bases. They were central to the rise of Portugal's power and wealth. By controlling the flow of precious goods, including gold, ivory, and slaves, Portugal established a capitalist economy that fueled the expansion of its empire, ultimately shaping the world's economic system. Through these outposts, Portugal became not just a maritime power, but a global economic force. And the legacy of these early Portuguese footholds continues to resonate in the world today. The quest for spices was not just a pursuit of luxury goods. It was the key to the future prosperity of nations, and none more so than Portugal. Spices like pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon were among the most valuable commodities in the world during the age of exploration, sought after not only for their flavor and medicinal properties, but for their role in preserving food, which was essential in an age without refrigeration. As trade in these commodities grew in demand, the Venetians and Ottomans controlled the major trade routes to the east, where spices were abundant. But this monopoly was not to last. For Portugal, breaking into the spice trade was a matter of both economic survival and religious duty. The Ottoman Empire's growing dominance over the eastern Mediterranean and the land-based spice routes posed a direct challenge to Portugal's economic interests. Portugal sought to bypass the Ottoman-controlled routes and discover an oceanic path to the spice-rich islands of Asia. This quest was not simply driven by economic greed. There was a strong religious component that tied into the Portuguese worldview. Prince Henry the Navigator and other Portuguese explorers saw their voyages as part of a Christian mission, an extension of the Reconquista that had swept through the Iberian Peninsula. The goal was to bring Christianity to the heathen lands of Africa, India, and beyond, making the pursuit of spices not only a means of wealth, but also a way to expand the Christian empire. The economic imperative of the spice trade was clear. By securing direct access to the spice markets of India and the East Indies, Portugal could bypass the costly Venetian middlemen, directly importing the valuable spices and profiting immensely. But just as importantly, the spice trade would bolster Portugal's naval power, providing the funds to establish a growing empire that spanned continents and reached into the heart of Asia. The culmination of Portugal's pursuit of spice routes came with Vasco da Gama's historic voyage to India in 1498. This voyage was not just a triumph of navigation, it was the moment when the Portuguese shifted the balance of global power and redefined the world's trade networks. Vasco da Gama's voyage was the result of years of preparation and investment. Under the direction of Prince Henry, Portuguese navigators developed the caravel, a revolutionary ship design that allowed them to navigate the treacherous Atlantic Ocean. Coupled with new navigational techniques and tools like the astrolabe and Portolan charts, these advances in technology enabled da Gama to sail around Africa's Cape of Good Hope and reach India, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled land routes. For Vasco da Gama, his mission was twofold: to establish a trade route to the spice-rich regions of India and to expand Portuguese influence in the Indian Ocean. On May 20th, 1498, after months of perilous travel, da Gama reached the port of Calicut on the southwest coast of India. marking the first time that Europeans had established a direct sea route to India. The Portuguese had successfully broken into the spice trade, and the world would never be the same. This journey was a military triumph, in the sense that it secured a military foothold for the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. But it was also a religious conquest, as da Gama's arrival in India was seen as part of Portugal's ongoing missionary efforts to spread Catholicism. Furthermore, it was a momentous economic expansion, for it meant that Portugal had successfully opened a direct trade route to Asia, securing access to the wealth of the East and bypassing the Ottoman and Venetian monopolies on spice trade. Vasco da Gama's voyage to India was a turning point in the balance of global power. By establishing a direct maritime route to Asia, Portugal gained exclusive control over spice trade from the Indian Ocean to Europe, changing the entire global economic landscape. In addition, Portugal gained strategic control of key ports along the East African coast, as well as key points in the Indian Ocean, such as Goa and Malacca, which allowed the Portuguese to establish a network of commercial outposts that would fuel their imperial ambitions for centuries. This voyage was not just a military conquest, it was a symbol of Portugal's growing dominance over the global trade routes, ensuring the kingdom's wealth and prosperity in the coming centuries. By controlling the spice trade, Portugal established itself as the first European global power, breaking away from the Ottoman and Venetian monopoly and changing the course of global history. In a broader sense, Vasco da Gama's 1498 voyage can be seen as the beginning of the modern global economy, where capitalist trading networks, imperial ambitions, and religious missions converged to shape the world's future. The spice trade wasn't just a pursuit of luxury, it was the foundation for Portugal's maritime empire. Driven by economic necessity, religious zeal, and technological innovation, Portugal's quest for spice routes redefined the course of world history. Vasco da Gama's 1498 voyage to India was the catalyst that set Portugal on the path to becoming a dominant global power, transforming global trade, expanding Christian influence, and paving the way for European exploration and empire building for centuries to come. By the early 16th century, Portugal's presence in the east was already established, but it was in Goa, on the western coast of India, that the Portuguese truly found their spiritual and commercial hub. Goa was no mere outpost. It became the centerpiece of Portugal's ambitions in Asia, a city where trade, religion, and empire building converged. Its location, nestled on the shores of the Arabian Sea, made it a natural choice for Portuguese expansion, as it was positioned to control the Indian Ocean trade routes and serve as a gateway to the riches of India, the East Indies, and China. The Bay of Goa offered a deep-water harbor perfect for large Portuguese ships, which could now secure safe passage to the spice-rich islands of Southeast Asia. The strategic significance of this location cannot be overstated. Goa was more than a safe haven for ships. It was an ideal base for Portuguese naval operations, allowing them to protect their maritime routes from rival powers like the Ottomans, the Venetians, and the local Indian rulers. Portuguese dominance over Goa would allow them to control not only Indian trade, but also the essential passage to the East Indies, where the spices, silks, and precious gems of the world could be accessed. Moreover, Goa's natural resources, from its fertile land to its access to gold and ivory from the African coast, made it an irresistible prize for the Portuguese. This strategic location also allowed the Portuguese to establish powerful forts and military outposts, ensuring they could defend their growing empire from foreign rivals and even local resistance. However, Goa's significance wasn't solely tied to its strategic position and natural resources. It was the cultural and religious impact of Goa that truly set it apart. With the arrival of Jesuit missionaries in the early 1500s, Goa quickly became the epicenter of Catholic missionary activity in Asia. The Portuguese saw their mission not just as a quest for wealth, but also as part of a religious endeavor to spread Christianity in what they believed to be a heathen world. The church in Goa became a symbol of Portuguese Christian authority, with missionaries following the Portuguese traders into the heart of India and beyond. In addition to its spiritual importance, Goa was a commercial nexus. As Portugal's spice trade empire flourished, Goa served as the launch point for the flow of valuable goods from the East Indies to Europe. The Portuguese controlled the spice routes, monopolizing the trade of pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, which had become indispensable in European kitchens and medicine. Goa was a place where goods, culture, and religion intersected, making it a melting pot of Portuguese and local influences. It wasn't just a Portuguese outpost. It became a symbol of empire, a place where the Portuguese crown cemented its influence over Asia. In 1511, Afonso de Albuquerque, one of Portugal's most ambitious and skilled commanders, achieved a monumental victory in the Indian Ocean, the conquest of Malacca. Located on the Malay Peninsula, Malacca was the key port connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, controlling one of the busiest and most valuable trade routes in the world. By taking control of Malacca, the Portuguese sought to dominate the spice trade and establish an unchallenged presence in the heart of Southeast Asia. The strategic importance of Malacca was immediate. The city served as the principal gateway between the East Indies, China, and India. If Portugal could control Malacca, it would have a chokehold over the spice trade, securing its monopoly over the global spice market. Before the Portuguese arrived, Malacca had been a thriving hub for Arab, Indian, and Chinese traders. It was ruled by the Sultan of Malacca, but his power was weak compared to the might of the Portuguese navy. The conquest of Malacca was not just a military victory. It was a triumph of Portuguese ambition to control the flow of wealth from the east to Europe. By taking Malacca, Portugal could dominate the routes that brought spices, silk, and precious metals from the East Indies and China to the west. The Portuguese saw this as a necessary move to secure economic dominance in Asia and ensure their access to the riches of the East Indies. Malacca's value was not just in its strategic location, it was the key to controlling Southeast Asia's trade routes. By holding Malacca, the Portuguese controlled the entry points to China, India, and the Spice Islands of the East Indies, where nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were in high demand in Europe. The spice trade was the foundation of Portuguese prosperity in Asia, and with Malacca in their hands, the Portuguese ensured that they would remain the preeminent power in the Indian Ocean. Additionally, Malacca was critical for global trade because it was one of the few places that could serve as a transshipment point for goods moving between China, India, and the rest of the world. The city acted as a marketplace where merchants could exchange a wide range of goods. By controlling this port, Portugal was able to ensure that all goods passing through Malacca were subject to Portuguese control, guaranteeing them a monopoly over the spice trade and other high-value goods. The conquest of Malacca had profound effects on both global trade networks and the local economy. On the one hand, it reinforced Portuguese dominance in Southeast Asia. With Malacca in their possession, the Portuguese were able to establish a powerful network of outposts in the region, including Goa and Macau, and create a spice route that would fuel their empire for the next century. The city became a crucial link in a global trading network, connecting Europe to the riches of the East. On the other hand, the conquest of Malacca disrupted local economies. The Sultanate of Malacca, once a thriving trade power in Southeast Asia, was brought under Portuguese control, changing the dynamics of trade in the region. The local population found themselves subjected to Portuguese rule and the city's prosperity, once fueled by its open trade policies and multicultural influences, shifted under the imposition of Portuguese monopolies. However, Malacca's economic integration into the Portuguese Empire also meant that it began to prosper under Portuguese administration, becoming a vital hub for the flow of spices and other goods. The Portuguese established a stronghold here that ensured they could control trade across the Indian Ocean, setting the stage for global economic domination. The conquests of Goa and Malacca represented more than just military victories. They were strategic moves that allowed Portugal to establish itself as a global maritime empire. Goa became the spiritual and commercial hub of Portuguese influence in Asia, while Malacca secured Portugal's dominance over the critical spice trade routes in Southeast Asia. These two regions helped Portugal cement its position as a world power in the 16th century, not only by controlling key trade routes, but by integrating economic, cultural, and religious power into one coherent imperial strategy. In the early 1500s, the Indian Ocean was a bustling theatre of trade, ruled not by any single power, but by a complex network of regional kingdoms, Arab merchants, and Indian and Chinese traders. It was here that Portugal would seek to establish its dominance through a combination of military brilliance, political strategy, and unmatched naval prowess. At the heart of these efforts was Afonso de Albuquerque, whose vision for Portuguese expansion was rooted not in just acquiring land, but in securing vital maritime choke points that would control the flow of wealth across the seas. Albuquerque's approach to empire building was grounded in a sharp understanding of the geopolitical significance of specific maritime choke points. His first key conquest was the capture of Goa in 1510, a move that would cement Portuguese influence in India and make it the spiritual and commercial hub of their empire in the east. But Goa was just the beginning. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, was the next target, a vital choke point that allowed access to the rich trade routes leading to Persia, India, and beyond. In 1507, Albuquerque's forces successfully took Ormuz, a fortified city on a small island just off the coast of Persia. This strategic position allowed the Portuguese to control the Persian Gulf, a crucial route for both spices and precious goods coming from the east. By controlling Hormuz, Albuquerque ensured that Portugal had a foothold in the region, establishing Portuguese power as a significant force in Persian and Arabian trade routes. However, it was Albuquerque's conquest of Malacca in 1511 that marked the most significant moment in his career. Malacca, located at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, controlled the vital sea lanes between India, China, and the East Indies. By taking Malacca, Albuquerque ensured that the Portuguese would have direct access to the Spice Islands and other wealthy trading regions in Southeast Asia. This conquest not only allowed Portugal to dominate the spice trade, but also gave them control over a critical trade hub that connected the East to the West. Albuquerque's military genius wasn't just about brute force. It was about securing critical locations that could serve as launch points for further expansion and control. His ability to blend brutal conquest with diplomatic finesse allowed him to maintain a series of alliances with local rulers, ensuring that the Portuguese Empire could consolidate its power in the East. Albuquerque's military and political strategies were not just driven by personal ambition, but by a clear vision of empire building. While he was undoubtedly a ruthless conqueror, his tactics were rooted in a deep strategic understanding of how to sustain Portuguese power across a vast, distant empire. Albuquerque was more than a conqueror. He was a visionary who understood that military might alone would not guarantee Portuguese dominance. He knew that naval power, trade control, and military outposts needed to be tightly interwoven into a seamless network. His approach to the East was multifaceted. While ruthless in battle, he also employed political tact to negotiate with local rulers and build alliances where necessary. Albuquerque's ability to blend military conquest with diplomacy allowed Portugal to gain influence across a broad range of regions without having to rely solely on brute force. Yet, his ruthlessness should not be underestimated. He was fully prepared to use force when necessary, particularly when his empire's economic interests were threatened. The capture of Malacca, for example, was marked by a bloody siege, showcasing both his tactical brilliance and his willingness to make sacrifices for the larger goals of empire building. The long-term consequences of Albuquerque's conquests were profound. His establishment of Portuguese trading outposts in key locations like Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz set the stage for Portugal's maritime dominance in the Indian Ocean and beyond. But these actions also laid the groundwork for Portuguese colonial ventures, turning Portugal into one of the first global empires. Albuquerque's success meant that Portugal would dominate the spice trade, reaping the immense profits from pepper, cloves, and nutmeg that would sustain the empire for generations. No discussion of Afonso de Albuquerque's success in the Indian Ocean is complete without understanding the critical role that Portuguese naval superiority played in his campaigns. The ability to control the seas was not just about having more ships. It was about having ships equipped with cutting-edge technology and advanced tactics that could outmaneuver and outgun any rival fleet. The caravel was one of the most important innovations that allowed Portugal to dominate the seas during the age of exploration. Unlike traditional Mediterranean ships, the caravel was a small, agile vessel designed to navigate both coastal waters and open seas. Equipped with lateen sails, which allowed the ship to sail more efficiently into the wind, the caravel could explore uncharted waters and maneuver quickly in battle. But it wasn't just the caravel's design that made the Portuguese navy dominant. It was their use of artillery. By outfitting these ships with powerful cannonry, Portugal's navy could engage in long-range combat, crippling enemy ships before closing in for the kill. Albuquerque's tactics often relied on using cannon fire to damage or disable rival fleets before sending in Portuguese forces to board and capture the vessels. The Portuguese ability to wield artillery effectively at sea gave them a decisive edge over rivals, especially in the open waters of the Indian Ocean. Portuguese naval strategy was not merely about having superior ships or firepower. It was about using these elements to dominate trade routes and control strategic choke points. Portugal's navy was designed to protect Portuguese trade interests by enforcing blockades and engaging in raids against rival traders and powers, such as the Ottomans, Arab merchants, and the Dutch. Albuquerque's tactics included coordinated naval actions. His ships would often work in tandem to outmaneuver and overwhelm enemy forces. Afonso de Albuquerque's legacy as the architect of Portuguese imperial power in the Indian Ocean cannot be overstated. His strategic brilliance, combined with Portugal's naval superiority, allowed the Portuguese to secure key trade routes, choke points, and key outposts that would lay the foundation for a global empire. His innovative use of naval tactics and artillery reshaped the way naval warfare was conducted, and his relentless pursuit of Portuguese dominance in the East ensured that Portugal remained the world's leading maritime power for much of the 16th century. By combining brutal conquest, diplomatic strategy, and technological innovation, Albuquerque's influence remains one of the most transformative periods in Portuguese and global history. His efforts not only secured Portuguese trade routes, but also set the stage for the age of European empires, whose naval power would shape the world for centuries to come. The Portuguese Empire, at its height in the 16th century, was not only the first global empire, but also one of the wealthiest powers in the world. Portugal's control over global trade routes and its monopoly over precious commodities like spices, gold, and slaves provided the kingdom with immense wealth. But how exactly did Portugal manage to extract such wealth from its vast empire? And how did this influence Lisbon and the broader European economy? At the heart of this economic prosperity was the spice trade, the most lucrative commodity in the 16th century. Spices like pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon were more valuable than gold in many parts of the world. The Portuguese, having secured a monopoly over key maritime routes from India to the East Indies, became the exclusive gatekeepers of this highly sought-after trade. Their control over Malacca, Goa, and Hormuz allowed them to dominate the movement of spices from Asia to Europe, bypassing the Venetian middlemen who had long controlled the flow of goods from the east. The wealth from spices didn't just fill the royal coffers. It allowed Portugal to expand its navy, fortify its empire, and engage in further explorations. The influx of riches into Lisbon transformed it into a thriving, cosmopolitan hub, where wealth from the colonies was reinvested in the construction of ports, fortresses, and trade networks. This made Portugal the central player in the global trade system of the 16th century. Beyond spices, the Portuguese had a lucrative monopoly on African gold and ivory, as well as Brazilian sugar. From West Africa, Portuguese traders controlled the gold trade, sending vast amounts of the precious metal back to Lisbon, making Portugal a crucial link in the global gold supply chain. Gold from Mali and Ghana fueled Portugal's expanding maritime ventures, financing naval expeditions and enriching the state. Meanwhile, ivory became another valuable commodity, and the Portuguese were also involved in the burgeoning slave trade, which would have lasting consequences for the empire and its colonies. Meanwhile, the discovery of Brazil and its sugar production became another economic boon for Portugal. Brazilian sugar plantations, which relied heavily on the labor of African slaves, became the foundation of Portugal's wealth in the Americas. Brazil not only provided immense resources, but also connected the Portuguese Empire to the transatlantic slave trade, linking Africa, Europe, and the Americas in a new global system of economic exchange. The control of the spice trade was no accident. Portugal's dominance in this area was the result of a carefully orchestrated combination of exploration, naval superiority, and strategic military conquests. The Portuguese were able to bypass traditional trade routes controlled by the Venetians and Ottomans, instead establishing direct maritime routes from Lisbon to the east. The Portuguese navy, led by figures like Vasco da Gama and Afonso de Albuquerque, was the backbone of their success. Portugal's caravels, designed for both speed and maneuverability, allowed them to explore previously uncharted territories. These ships were equipped with advanced artillery and navigation tools like the astrolabe, which gave Portuguese sailors the ability to navigate the Indian Ocean with precision. Once in the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese focused on securing key trading posts and fortifications. The conquest of Malacca in 1511 was pivotal. Malacca was a gateway to the spice-rich islands of the East Indies, and its capture allowed Portugal to control the flow of spices from the region to Europe. Similarly, the capture of Goa in 1510 made it a commercial center for Portuguese trade in India and a launch point for further conquests in the Indian Ocean. By controlling these crucial maritime choke points, the Portuguese ensured that they could monopolize the spice trade for much of the 16th century. They were not simply opportunists, they were empire builders, constructing a vast network of ports and strongholds that would allow them to dominate global trade for generations. They leveraged military power and naval control to ensure that they could continue to dictate terms of trade across the Indian Ocean and beyond. The Portuguese Empire was more than just an economic powerhouse. It was a conduit for cultural exchange. As the Portuguese expanded across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they facilitated an exchange of ideas, religions, and traditions that would shape the world for centuries. At the forefront of this cultural exchange were the Jesuit missionaries, who played a significant role in the spread of Christianity throughout the empire. Francisco Xavier, one of the most famous Jesuit missionaries, helped to spread Catholicism in India, Japan, and China. However, their mission was not just to convert, it was also to understand the local cultures, which contributed to the cross-pollination of ideas between Europe and the East. But the cultural impact of the Portuguese Empire went beyond religion. The Portuguese presence in India, Brazil, and Africa led to the creation of hybrid cultures that blended European, African, and Asian traditions. The fusion of Portuguese and Indian cultures in Goa, for example, resulted in unique forms of architecture, art, and literature. Similarly, in Brazil, the blending of Portuguese, indigenous, and African cultures led to the creation of Brazilian identity, which remains distinct to this day. But the exchange wasn't always harmonious. The Portuguese Empire, like many colonial powers, sought to dominate the societies it came into contact with, often disregarding local customs and religions in favor of Christianization and Europeanization. The empire's role in the slave trade and its imposition of European culture had lasting consequences on global identity and cultural exchange. The Portuguese Empire was a force of tremendous economic power and cultural exchange, but it was also a force of domination and exploitation. The wealth generated by the spice trade, gold, and slave labor helped make Portugal one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, but it was built on the backs of exploited populations across the globe. The cultural exchange facilitated by the empire's vast network of colonies had far-reaching impacts, blending European, African, and Asian traditions in ways that shaped the global cultural landscape. While the Portuguese Empire contributed to the global economy, its legacy is also marked by the costs of colonialism, the violence, the forced conversions, and the displacement of native cultures. The cultural fusion that occurred under Portuguese rule was profound, but it was a fusion shaped by the forces of empire building and exploitation. In the end, the Portuguese Empire was a force of both wealth creation and cultural exchange, but its legacy remains complex. An empire that connected the world, but also shaped the global economy and culture in ways that are still felt today. The Portuguese Empire, once a dominant maritime power in the 16th century, had enjoyed remarkable success, amassing vast wealth through the spice trade, gold, and slave labor. However, by the mid-17th century, the empire began to falter, and what had once been a powerful and expansive empire began to decline. The causes of this decline were complex, involving internal challenges, economic shifts, and a growing rivalry with European powers. At the heart of Portugal's decline was a combination of internal issues that gradually eroded the foundations of the empire. Perhaps the most significant factor was the growing corruption within the Portuguese court and the colonial administration. The influx of wealth from the spice trade and Brazilian gold during the empire's heyday led to a lavish lifestyle for the Portuguese elite, while the resources of the empire were increasingly misused and diverted for personal gain. The Portuguese monarchy failed to implement meaningful reforms that could address the systemic corruption within the empire's ruling class. Instead, the empire's wealth became unsustainable, with much of it siphoned off by the noble class. Another critical internal factor was mismanagement. Following the reign of King Juan III, 1521 to 1557, who had presided over the empire's peak, Portugal's royal leadership lacked the strategic vision necessary to handle the empire's vast global holdings. The loss of strong leadership resulted in political instability and inefficiency in managing the empire's trade routes and colonial ventures. This was exacerbated by the overextension of Portuguese influence. At its peak, the empire stretched from the coasts of Africa to South America, and from the Indian Ocean to East Asia, making it nearly impossible to govern effectively without proper military support and administrative oversight. The empire's naval dominance, once its greatest strength, was increasingly difficult to maintain. The Portuguese navy, which had been the backbone of empire building, began to deteriorate, largely due to the lack of investment and attention from the Portuguese crown. Portugal's naval superiority, which had once allowed them to control key trade routes and oversee colonies, was no longer as decisive. And infrastructure, such as fortifications in key ports like Malacca and Goa, was left vulnerable to external threats. Additionally, social unrest within the colonies, particularly in Brazil, began to undermine the empire's control. Portuguese settlers and indigenous populations clashed, leading to rising resistance movements and rebellions in the Americas, adding to the pressures on the Portuguese state. The structural flaws of the Portuguese Empire can be traced to its reliance on colonial wealth and its failure to adapt to changing global dynamics. While the empire thrived on the spice trade in the early years, it failed to diversify its economic activities or develop sustainable industries within its colonies. This overdependence on single resource economies, like sugar in Brazil or spices in the East Indies, meant that any disruption to these industries could cripple the entire empire's finances. The empire's bureaucratic inefficiency and weak central authority made it difficult to respond effectively to the emerging challenges from rival European powers. Unlike the Dutch or the English, Portugal failed to build a strong naval alliance system and corporate trading networks. The lack of coordination between the Portuguese crown and its colonial enterprises meant that while one part of the empire prospered, another might fall into disarray. Economic monopolies, such as the control over Asian spices and African gold, became harder to maintain as rivals adapted to global market shifts. While the Portuguese Empire had once been able to use its naval superiority to dominate global trade, by the early 17th century, these strategies were increasingly out of step with the times. The Dutch, English, and Spanish all launched aggressive campaigns against Portugal's monopoly on trade, and Portugal found itself unable to adapt to the rise of new global powers. By the early 17th century, Portugal's rivals were beginning to challenge its imperial position. The Dutch, English, and Spanish all sought to expand their own global empires, each one taking a piece of Portugal's vast trade networks. The Dutch were particularly instrumental in the decline of Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, founded in 1602, was an efficient and ruthless commercial enterprise that quickly gained a foothold in the spice trade. The Dutch challenge to Portuguese control in the East Indies was relentless, and by the 1640s, the Dutch had captured key Portuguese territories, such as the Moluccas and Malacca, cutting into Portugal's monopoly on the spice trade. The Dutch naval superiority, based on their innovative ship designs and well-coordinated fleet tactics, was a significant factor in dismantling the Portuguese Empire's ability to defend its colonies. At the same time, the English were beginning to build their own empire in Asia, establishing the English East India Company in 1600. With the English Navy expanding its power in the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese found themselves in direct competition with an increasingly capable rival. The English targeted key Portuguese possessions in India and the Indian Ocean, weakening Portuguese influence in the region. The Spanish were another major rival. While the Iberian Union, 1580-1640, meant that Spain and Portugal were briefly united under a single crown, this period also saw Portugal increasingly sidelined by Spanish priorities. Spain, focusing on its American empire, neglected Portugal's Asian holdings, allowing other European powers to seize the opportunity to expand their own influence. The Union weakened the Portuguese crown's ability to defend its empire and further destabilized the kingdom. The Dutch played the most significant role in the decline of the Portuguese Empire, especially in Asia. The Dutch East India Company's rise was a direct challenge to Portugal's control over global trade routes, and their efficient use of naval power quickly undermined Portuguese dominance. By the 1640s, the Dutch had taken control of key spice islands, including Banda and the Moluccas, and disrupted Portuguese shipping lanes across the Indian Ocean. The Dutch challenge to Portugal's economic monopoly had far-reaching effects. Once the Dutch gained control of the spice trade, they reoriented it to serve their own economic interests, bypassing the Portuguese and establishing their own trade routes that outpaced Portugal's. The loss of these territories signaled the end of Portuguese economic dominance in Asia and Africa, marking the shift from a Portuguese-controlled maritime world to a Dutch and English-led one. The decline of the Portuguese Empire was the result of a combination of internal failures and external challenges. Corruption, mismanagement, and overextension within the empire weakened its ability to maintain control over its vast territories. At the same time, the rise of rival powers, like the Dutch and English, coupled with the inefficiency of the Iberian Union, further eroded Portugal's dominance in the global economy. While Portugal was able to maintain a presence in Africa and Brazil well into the 18th century, its control over critical trade routes and its ability to dominate the spice trade were irreversibly weakened by the Dutch challenge. The rise of Dutch naval power and the establishment of their own trade monopolies signaled the end of Portugal's golden age as a maritime empire. The fall of the Portuguese Empire was inevitable in many ways, but it could have been delayed had the empire been able to adapt to the changing geopolitical and economic landscape. In the end, Portugal's failure to modernize its naval power and economic practices allowed more adaptable rivals to take its place on the world stage, marking the beginning of the end for one of the world's first global empires. In 1580, the Portuguese crown was left without a direct heir after the death of King Henry. This power vacuum set the stage for Spain's Philip II to claim the Portuguese throne, resulting in the Iberian Union, a union of crowns that would forever alter the destiny of Portugal. The Iberian Union lasted for 60 years, from 1580 to 1640, and was a turning point in Portuguese history. This period, under Spanish rule, proved to be devastating for Portugal's autonomy. Though Portugal retained its administrative structures, its sovereign rights were effectively lost. Under Philip II, Portugal was treated as a province within the larger Spanish Empire. Portuguese kings, the royal court, and even the noble class were sidelined by Spanish priorities, particularly in the context of the Spanish Habsburg Empire's European conflicts. The Spanish occupation of Portugal led to political suppression of Portuguese governance. One of the most significant impacts was the loss of Portugal's diplomatic independence. Spain's imperial policies began to govern Portugal's actions, as Portuguese interests were subordinated to those of the larger Spanish Empire. The economic monopoly that Portugal once held over the spice trade, the Atlantic, and Asia began to crumble under Spanish neglect. Spain's naval priorities, focused on maintaining control over the Spanish Armada and dealing with European rivals, often meant that Portugal's maritime power was underfunded and undermined. Portuguese merchants, who had once dominated the spice routes from India to Europe, were now increasingly cut out of trade in favor of Spanish interests. As a result, Portuguese trade networks deteriorated, and colonial revenues that had once poured into Lisbon began to dry up. Moreover, Spain's military campaigns in Europe diverted resources away from defending Portuguese possessions, especially in the East Indies and Brazil. The Dutch and English began to challenge Portuguese supremacy in key regions such as Malacca and Goa, effectively eroding the empire's economic base. Economically, the Iberian Union was a catastrophic setback for Portugal. While Spain benefited from Portugal's colonial wealth, the lack of oversight and investment in Portugal's global empire meant the country was left vulnerable. Brazilian sugar, once a vital source of revenue for Portugal, was increasingly contested by the Dutch in Brazil, and spice trade monopolies in Asia were lost to the Dutch East India Company. Politically, Portugal was reduced to a satellite state in Spain's growing empire, with few options for independent action. The lack of a Portuguese monarch meant that Portugal's priorities were governed from Madrid. Though Portugal's elite tried to retain some influence, they were largely powerless against Spanish decrees, which led to growing resentment across Portuguese society. The economic decline and political disempowerment fostered a growing sense of nationalism among the Portuguese. The longer the union lasted, the more the idea of Portuguese identity crystallized, especially in light of Spanish mismanagement and foreign incursions. After decades of political subjugation, Portugal's desire for independence exploded into the Restoration War. The revolt began on December 1st, 1640, when a group of Portuguese nobles and military leaders, frustrated by Spanish control, seized the royal palace in Lisbon and declared the restoration of Portuguese sovereignty. This was a turning point in Portugal's national history, symbolizing the end of Spanish domination and the resurgence of Portuguese power. The Restoration War was a military and political conflict, but it was also a battle for national identity. The Portuguese resented not only the political oppression, but also the economic exploitation that had accompanied Spanish rule. As Portugal sought to regain its independence, the Braganza family, who claimed legitimate descent from the Portuguese monarchy, emerged as the figureheads of the Restoration movement. The Portuguese resistance was not just about reclaiming a crown, but about reasserting their sovereignty as a distinct nation. The Restoration War was not a quick or easy victory. After the seizure of the palace, Spanish forces attempted to suppress the revolt, but the Portuguese resistance quickly gathered strength. Military leaders, particularly João IV, rallied the Portuguese population against their Spanish rulers. Over several years of fighting, the Portuguese military, supported by local militias, managed to push the Spanish forces out of key territories. Spain's distracted position, engaged in multiple wars across Europe, also played a pivotal role. By 1668, after nearly 3 decades of resistance and internal strife, the Treaty of Lisbon was signed, officially recognizing Portugal's independence from Spain. The Restoration of 1640 is one of the most defining moments in Portuguese history. It reflects not just military triumph, but also national resilience. After decades of Spanish occupation, the Portuguese were able to reclaim their sovereignty in the face of overwhelming odds. The movement represented a rebirth of Portuguese identity and a return to autonomy that was crucial for the survival of the nation. However, the Restoration of 1640 also marked the end of an era. The Portuguese Empire, once a leading force in global trade and exploration, was no longer the powerhouse it had been. The global dominance that had fueled Portugal's wealth was in sharp decline, especially as the Dutch, English, and French had seized much of Portugal's previous influence in Asia, Africa, and South America. While the Restoration affirmed Portugal's sovereignty, it also marked the transition from an era of imperial grandeur to one of national rebuilding and economic recovery. The empire had shrunk significantly, and Portugal's place in the world was no longer at the center of global trade. The Restoration of 1640 was a victory of national pride, but it also marked the end of Portugal's dominance in the global arena. Portugal regained its independence from Spain, but the global world had already moved on. The Dutch, English, and French had risen to challenge the power that Portugal once held, and while Portugal would remain a sovereign nation, its role as an imperial giant was over. The Restoration War not only reasserted Portugal's independence, but it also redefined the nation's place in the world. The golden age of Portuguese exploration and empire building was gone, but the spirit of resilience, the ability to reclaim autonomy from external forces, would shape Portugal's future in ways that resonate even today. The Portuguese Empire, the first European global empire, left a legacy that stretched far beyond its decline in the 19th century. Spanning continents, oceans, and cultures, its impact was felt in global trade, the spread of Christianity, and cultural exchanges that continue to shape societies around the world today. From Brazil to Mozambique, the influence of Portugal's imperial ambitions is still visible, woven into the fabric of modern-day nations that were once under its dominion. At its height, the Portuguese Empire was a key player in global trade. Portugal's maritime dominance in the 15th and 16th centuries allowed it to control key sea routes, connect continents, and establish a vast network of trade posts and colonies. Portugal's ships carried goods, ideas, and people across the world, fueling the rise of a global economy that eventually reshaped the way nations interacted. Portuguese traders opened up new markets, linking Europe with Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This economic network laid the foundations for what would later become the modern capitalist economy. Beyond economics, the spread of Christianity was another central feature of Portugal's global mission. Jesuit missionaries, most famously Francisco Xavier, ventured into the heart of Asia, India, and Japan, bringing with them a version of Christianity that shaped religious practices and political structures in places as diverse as China, Goa, and Japan. Brazil, which became the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world, still bears the mark of Catholicism in its culture, festivals, and architecture, a legacy that continues to resonate across generations. But the empire's cultural legacy is far more complex than the spread of religion. Portuguese influence can be seen in the art, language, architecture, and social structures that took root in the colonial territories. Mozambique, Angola, and Goa carry the imprint of Portuguese culture in their linguistic and religious practices, with Portuguese remaining the official language in several countries long after decolonization. While Brazil is often considered the most significant living testament to Portugal's influence, the legacy of the Portuguese Empire can still be found in many corners of the globe. Brazil, with its vast population of Portuguese speakers, is not just a linguistic legacy, but a country shaped by centuries of Portuguese colonial rule. The Portuguese language, as the most widely spoken Romance language outside of Europe, remains a dominant force in global communication, culture, and education. But beyond the language, Brazilian identity is deeply rooted in the Portuguese colonial experience, from its religious practices to its legal system, urban architecture, and cultural traditions. In Africa, the remnants of Portuguese colonialism are still visible, particularly in countries like Mozambique and Angola. where Portuguese is the official language and Catholicism plays a significant role in social and cultural life. Mozambique and Angola, both once crucial parts of the empire, continue to grapple with the effects of Portuguese colonial policies, which left deep economic scars. However, their cultural legacies, such as literature, art, and music, are heavily influenced by their Portuguese heritage, providing a unique blend of African and European traditions. In India, Goa stands as a powerful symbol of Portuguese rule, where Baroque architecture, Christian monuments, and Portuguese-influenced customs still mark the landscape. Macau, another key Portuguese colony in Asia, remains a unique fusion of Portuguese and Chinese cultures, a testament to the empire's ability to blend local traditions with European influences. Despite the lasting legacies of the Portuguese Empire, the decline of Portuguese influence was inevitable. By the 17th century, the Portuguese Empire was already under siege from both internal pressures and external challenges. The rise of Dutch, English, and French colonial powers in the Indian Ocean and Brazil gradually eroded Portugal's dominance in global trade. Portugal's colonial holdings, which once spanned continents, began to shrink as other European powers seized key territories and trade routes. The Iberian Union, 1580 to 1640, when Spain absorbed Portugal, further weakened the empire's global position. Although Portugal regained independence in 1640, the damage had already been done. The Dutch and English had outpaced Portugal in building global trading empires, and Portuguese influence in the East Indies and Brazil dwindled. As Brazil declared its independence in 1822, the final chapter of Portugal's colonial empire closed. Portugal itself, now a smaller nation-state, faced significant economic difficulties and political instability in the aftermath of its empire's collapse. While Brazil flourished, Portugal struggled to adapt to the changing world order, with the Industrial Revolution bypassing the Iberian Peninsula and its imperial networks shrinking. Today, historians view the Portuguese Empire through a multifaceted lens. On one hand, it is seen as a pioneer of global trade, the first European nation to establish global maritime networks that connected Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Portuguese explorers were instrumental in charting new seas, and their innovative shipbuilding techniques and navigation skills set the stage for later empires. The Portuguese Empire was a monumental force in shaping the global economy, particularly in trade routes that continued to drive international commerce. On the other hand, modern historians also acknowledge the darker side of the Portuguese legacy. The empire was built on exploitation, particularly the transatlantic slave trade, which brought millions of Africans to the Americas under brutal conditions. The colonial system in places like Brazil and Africa left deep social scars that would persist long after decolonization. The Portuguese, like other colonial powers, imposed their culture, religion, and economic systems on indigenous populations, often at the expense of local cultures and societies. The question of how to view the Portuguese Empire is complex. Was it a monument to exploration and cultural exchange, or a tool of exploitation that reinforced colonial oppression and economic inequality? Both perspectives are valid. The Portuguese Empire was undoubtedly a force of cultural exchange, connecting continents and creating a global network of trade, ideas, and religions. It opened the world to new possibilities for exchange and helped lay the foundations for the modern global economy. But at the same time, the Portuguese Empire was also a system of domination that enriched the Portuguese at the expense of native populations and enslaved people. Ultimately, the legacy of the Portuguese Empire is multifaceted, a legacy of global exploration, cultural fusion, and economic innovation, but also one of exploitation, displacement, and human suffering. Its lasting impact is still visible in the language, culture, and religion of its former colonies. But so too are the remnants of colonial oppression and economic inequality. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found this one captivating, you're in for a treat with the next one. It's just as fascinating, if not more, than you could ever imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next adventure.